Mr. Ashish Ray is an award-winning broadcaster and a grandnephew of Indian freedom fighter Subhash Chandra Bose. Mr. Ray has reported or commented on cricket for almost every major British and Indian newspaper and has been a member of the BBC's Test Match Special Commentary team. A foreign correspondent in London since 1977, Mr. Ray became CNN's first South Asia bureau chief in 1992 before being appointed its consultant editor. He sometimes lectures on South Asian matters at Oxford University and at the London School of Economics. Our guest today is Ashish Ray. He's a remarkable man in his own right. He's a journalist and commentator and an expert on the great British and Anglo-Indian sport of cricket. But more to the point, we're going to be talking about, well, he's the grand-nephew of Subhash Chandra Bose, who is better known in India as Netaji, which he was one of the great freedom fighters. And we'll be talking about him and about other related subjects, because we were talking about the partition of India and the whole question of violence versus non-violence as an approach to situations that are difficult. Ashish, thank you so much for being our guest on ANN. It's really great to have you with us.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Oh, bless you. Well, we're going to move straight to our first subject, and first and foremost, our viewers need, because we're going to talk about the man known in India as Netaji, we need to tell them a little about him. So, over 7 decades after his death, the freedom fighter Subhash Chandra Bose, popularly known in India as Netaji or respected leader, remains one of the most intriguing figures in India's independence struggle. Born in 1897, Bose went to England as a young man in 1919 to compete for the Indian Civil Service exams. However, Bose was deeply disturbed by the actions of the British in India at that time and left his civil service apprenticeship to return to India in 1921. After returning to India, Netaji came under the influence of Mahatma Gandhi and joined the Indian National Congress. He quickly showed his leadership potential and climbed way up the Congress hierarchy. In 1928, the Motilal Nehru Committee, appointed by the Congress, declared in favor of Dominion status for India. But Subhash Chandra Bose, along with Nehru, opposed it and asserted that he would not be satisfied with anything less than complete independence for India. Netaji was jailed during the civil disobedience movement in 1930, and after his release he was jailed again under the Bengal regulations and later banned from entering India. After returning to India, he was elected President of Congress in 1938 and then re-elected again in 1939. However, he was ousted from Congress leadership positions later in 1939, following differences with Mahatma Gandhi and the Congress High Command. Netaji then started a mass movement against the use of Indian resources and manpower in the Second World War. He was subsequently placed under house arrest by the British, escaping India in 1941 to Germany via Afghanistan. Working on the maxim that an enemy's enemy is a friend, he sought cooperation with Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan against the British Empire, with the help of the latter creating the famous Indian National Army in opposition to the British.
Subhash Bose was clearly one of the frontline leaders of the Indian freedom movement. He was part of what was called the triumvirate of Gandhi, Nehru and Bose. He studied at Cambridge, then passed his ICS, the Indian Civil Service examinations with flying colors, then resigned from the service and went back to India to fight for the country's freedom. In a matter of what was it, 17, 18 years, he rose from the ranks to become the president of the Indian National Congress. So quite a meteoric rise, a charismatic character on the Indian political scene. Then he fell out with Gandhi ideologically, and thereafter went away from India and finally formed what was called the Indian National Army in Southeast Asia. And the Indian National Army did attack the northeast of India to liberate the country, but then were forced to retreat, and ultimately they had to surrender. So that venture itself did not succeed, but what happened was that the officers of the INA, the Indian National Army, were put on trial at the Red Fort in Delhi, and that really created a storm. It brought the country together, and the three who were put on trial, by the way, one was a Hindu, the second was a Muslim, and the third was a Sikh. And that really united the government against the Raj, and thereby, I would imagine, hastened Britain's exit from Britain, because originally the independence of India was scheduled to take place in 1948, but in actual fact it was August 1947 that India won freedom.
Wow. So really you have these two great ideologies, the ideology of the man Subhash Chandra Bose, who is known today in India as Netaji. What is Netaji, by the way?
Netaji means great leader.
Great, okay. And then in the sense, it's an honorific, in the sense, much the same way as Gandhi, they call him Mahatma, don't they? Which is again, what is that?
It means great soul.
So we have, well, there you are, we have great leader and great soul, Mahatma and Netaji, these two figures with two very different ideologies of struggle for freedom. One believing in the fight, the battle by physical means, and the other believing in a different kind of struggle, his non-violent approach. The and then I mean, just to set the just to give a little more background, the Netaji remains controversial up to a point to this day because of questions about what happened to him after the liberation of India or the independence of India or whatever, because his end is shrouded in mystery up to a point, isn't it?
Well, there is no mystery. It's a created mystery.
Right.
The fact is that he died following a plane crash in Taipei on the 18th of August 1945. The events were like this. On the 15th of August 1945, Japan surrendered in the Second World War. And Japan had been Bose's ally during that INA campaign, Indian National Army campaign. So it was a joint effort really between the Japanese army and the Indian National Army. Yeah. And so once Japan surrendered, the Japanese authorities advised him to move away from Southeast Asia. He was actually in Singapore, and move to North Asia, Northeast Asia, ideally Japan. But Bose was contemplating really slipping away into the Soviet Union en route to Tokyo. So the journey that he undertook, that flight that he was taking, in those days it being a very different era, though they were hopping flights. So it was a hopping flight which stopped at Taipei, and the next stop was Daren in Manchuria, where he would possibly have escaped into the Soviet Union. But then as the plane after a refueling stop at Taipei was about to take off, it crashed, and he was severely injured. He suffered third-degree burns, injuries on his head. He was rushed to a military hospital in Taipei, and he died the same night, the 18th of August, 1945.
And why has this become, I mean, it's become, in India, I mean, our viewers, of course, are largely from the Middle East, and they may be, I don't want everybody to be bewildered by this, but it is a controversy in India, because there are, I mean, why should it matter in a way? But there is a bit of a sense of a conspiracy theory that he was killed in some way in Russia by the Russians, or is this right? It's a kind of...
There is undoubtedly a controversy. As I said, there is no mystery. Anyone accepting the truth would know that this is what happened. But the controversy arises for very many reasons. One of them being the fact that in 1942, British intelligence had put out a story that he had died as a result of a plane crash in Tokyo. This was not true, 1942, when in actual fact he was in Berlin, so quite far away. So when the 1945 story was reported by Reuters, there was skepticism in the family and among his followers, because they felt that this is something which was either not true and was being planted by British intelligence, or that he set up this story and has escaped to the Soviet Union, which he was certainly planning to do.
I see. So there were people dreaming of his return.
Absolutely.
Like a King Arthur figure coming back to save the country, or we see that in many situations. So people were dreaming of him coming back.
Correct.
As a father to the country, to rescue the country.
And you could well imagine that in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, matters were in complete turmoil. It was a traumatic situation for the Far East, including Japan. And so the information that was filtering out, A, was delayed, and B, it was insufficient. So people didn't have enough evidence to establish that he had definitely died as a result of that crash.
And was, I mean, just to ask the obvious question, I mean, he was, for the British, hugely, well, an enemy. Let's face it, he was their enemy. Gandhi, you could say, was their enemy, but Netaji was a more, in some senses, a more dangerous enemy. So begs the question, that plane crash in which he was killed, or which resulted in his death, that was an accident. It wasn't possibly some sort of assassination, but it was a genuine accidental crash.
It's doubtful if it was an assassination. There's no evidence to prove that there was any sabotage or anything of that kind. So it was most probably an accident. There was a problem with one of the engines on that Japanese bomber that he was flying on, and as soon as it rose to about 50 meters or so, there was a loud explosion on one side of the plane, and it simply dropped fairly close to the airfield from which it had taken off.
Okay. Interesting. So, so what a fascinating man. And this man, we talked about, but let's just, this is the independence struggle. And you have these three great figures, Nehru, Gandhi, and Netaji. And a fourth, no, Ali Jinnah? No, or would you?
Muhammad Ali Jinnah was the man who broke away from the Congress. He formed the Muslim League, and he campaigned for a separate homeland for Muslims.
Even back in those days? He was
he was slightly disgruntled as a congressman, and therefore he went a different way, and he demanded partition, and therefore Pakistan came into being.
Right. So in a sense, you have four giant figures, really, striding Indian politics in those days, and in the pre-independence India.
There were others, one should add.
Yes.
There was Vallabhbhai Patel, who became Deputy Prime Minister under Nehru when the government was formed after independence. There was Maulana Azad, another leader who was a Muslim but who remained with the Congress, and there were many who remained in India, remained with the mainstream movement in India, but there were others, a part of the elite in Lucknow, which was the capital of Uttar Pradesh, the northern province. They joined up with Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was from the west of the country. He came from the same part of India as Gandhi did, which is the state of Gujarat.
Right.
And he, of course, demanded and got Pakistan, and the rest is history.
So interesting. So these men, and would you, I mean, Netaji and Gandhi stood at, if you like, well, I don't know whether you do like, but at extreme opposites, in, as if different poles of the battery. They had a different, completely different approach.
Let me put it this way, that the mainstream movement of the independence struggle in India was the movement of the Indian National Congress. And the Indian National Congress was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. He was the supreme leader, and it was his ideology, which was an ideology of non-violent, non-cooperation, which took the movement forward. Now, everyone, including Subhash Bose, was a part of that movement. But where Bose and Gandhi differed was where Bose said that there should be use of force over and above the non-cooperation, non-violent non-cooperation. And that was an ideological point of view. It was a difference of opinion. The cause was exactly the same, which was the freedom of India. And as a matter of fact, Nehru and Bose, they stood together as far as economic and social matters went, because they were to the left of the party.
I see.
And so it's not as simple as saying that Gandhi was on the right and Bose was on the left, and Gandhi was for non-violence and Bose was for violence. Ultimately, as it happened, even Gandhi had to bow to a bit of violence, because his 1942 Quit India movement, in the absence of Subhash Bose, because Bose had left the country by that stage, became a violent movement. So things did go out of control, and so it wasn't as if the Gandhian movement remained purely non-violent throughout.
Now, I tell you, coming back then to Subhash Bose, Netaji, I mean, what sort of man? He was obviously a charismatic man. He was a man who believed in the military struggle against the British, and he was clearly an effective leader, but in a sense, I mean, I guess his mistake was to back the wrong side in a sense in the Second World War. I mean, was that unfair? I mean, he looked for backing where he could get it, and the Japanese were fighting the British and so on. But that ultimately was his downfall. Then, was it, or would you say, or?
I would say that he erred in terms of his alliance. He was originally inspired by the Irish independence movement.
Yes.
And therefore, this use of force over and above democratic means came from that movement. But yes, he erred in terms of being ultimately on the wrong side of the Second World War, although that didn't really make a difference in India. He remained a hero, because his struggle with the Indian National Army became the talk of legends.
Yes.
And ultimately, what happened was, and this is on record, that Field Marshal Auchinleck, who was then in charge of all British forces, not just in India, but the entire Southeast Asian region, he advised the then Viceroy of India, Wavell, that it was time to leave India, because what was happening is that the trial of the 3 officers of the INA was causing mutiny in the ranks of the Indian armed forces, which were under the British in those days. And so there was a slightly uncomfortable feeling that it could go out of control. A repeat of 1857, India's first war of independence, could take place, and therefore it wasn't as if Bose was entirely incorrect, but 2 things happened. One, his side lost the war, and unfortunately, tragically, he died before Indian independence.
Wow, extraordinary. And but what did happen to those 3 men that were on trial, the Sikh, the Muslim, and the Hindu?
Yes, interestingly, the charge against them was sedition, and it was that they were disloyal to the king and the emperor. They were found guilty, but they were let off because public pressure rose to such levels, and the same anger which I was referring to really went into boil, and therefore it was advisable that they were unconditionally released.
Wow. Okay. So let's let's move to the. I mean, because we need to, in a way, this brings us into the next issue. We need to talk about the partition of India. So if we do that and move our discussion on. In 1947, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, India, was granted independence. It was divided along religious lines into 2 nations, the one India, the other Pakistan. No consideration was given to the central issue of citizenship and that of security. Immediately, one of the greatest migrations in human history began to unfold as millions of Muslims trekked to West and East Pakistan, the latter now known as Bangladesh, while millions of Hindus and Sikhs headed in the opposite direction. Many hundreds of thousands never made it. Indeed, the partition left 10 million people displaced and well over 500,000 Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus dead in massacres. So, the partition of India, I mean, it must, if Netaji had lived to see Indian independence in that way, I mean, he would have been torn apart, wouldn't he? He'd been thrilled to see Indian independence, but he would have been dismayed to see India partitioned, obviously. I mean,
generally speaking, I think historians feel that Subhash Bose would have resisted the partition of India tooth and nail, because what was happening, that while within India there was this absolute cauldron of communal violence, of Hindus and Muslims killing each other, Muslims and Sikhs killing each other, but there was this superb example of the Indian National Army, where all those communities were together in absolute harmony. It was a fine example of secularism, the Indian National Army, if not anything else. And so he would certainly have resisted partition. It is fair to say that Mahatma Gandhi was also quite fiercely against partition. Not that Jawaharlal Nehru was in favor of partition, but it became possibly a fait accompli. And that's where I think the leaders, a little weary after decades of struggle, I think gave in. But there's a bit of a history there. There are 2 points of view on why partition took place. One is that Hindus and Muslims were never really reconciled to each other. For hundreds of years, the Mughals, meaning the Muslims, they ruled India, although they were a minority as compared to the population of Hindus. Thereafter, of course, the theory is, the other theory, which is that the British deliberately employed a policy of divide and rule between Hindus and Muslims, and therefore they were always sailing on different boats. And come 1947, the independence of India, a section of Muslims felt that they would suffer under a Hindu majority India. And so that was the basis of the demand for Pakistan. Although ironically, more Muslims stayed back in India than went to Pakistan.
That's right. And in fact, yes, because India has been, and still is, because Pakistan itself is partitioned now, and because you have Bangladesh and you have Pakistan, whereas so India to this day is the, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is the country in the world with the largest Muslim population, or is Indonesia?
India has the second largest Muslim population,
So
after Indonesia.
Indonesia, okay, interesting. And they, and of course, partition of India itself into what we now know as, well, it's now three countries: India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. That partition resulted in at least 1 million dead, didn't it? I mean, it was
Absolutely. People say that at least 1 million people died in the carnage, the communal carnage at the time of partition. And of course, it is also very interesting that East Pakistan did not remain a part of Pakistan, because that was an instance of Bengali nationalism triumphing over Islamic separatism, if you like.
Yes.
And that split what was British India or United India into three countries, and that's what it is even today.
With, to this day, terrible festering wounds like the Kashmir issue. I mean, well, classically, there are other problems, but the Kashmir issue is a product of this partition, and I mean, it's a whole another question, but it rumbles on. If we are seeing, are we, or I'm not sure, but are we seeing now an improvement in relationships between India and Pakistan? I mean, currently, in the current days, this era.
Well, I wouldn't say relations are particularly cordial at the moment.
Right.
And Kashmir has historically been the flashpoint.
Yes.
That is the dispute, the major dispute between the two countries, because Pakistan lays claim to Kashmir, which has a Muslim majority population, whereas India argues that India is a secular country, it's a multi-religious country, and there are more Muslims in India than in Pakistan.
Yes,
so
yes.
the Kashmiri Muslims are nothing but a part of Indian Muslims. That being the case, I think what had happened in the period of the Congress Party government, which was led by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh for 10 years between 2004 and 2014, there was a steady improvement in relations. There was even a proposal from the then President of Pakistan, General Pervez Musharraf, of a 4-point formula to resolve the Kashmir dispute. And this was seriously considered by India, but ultimately, for various reasons, partly because Pervez Musharraf lost power in Pakistan, the deal didn't go through.
What were his 4 points? Do you remember?
Well, first of all, I think he said that the present line of control, as it's called, which is the line which splits the state into Indian-controlled Jammu and Kashmir and Pakistan-controlled Kashmir, that line should be done away with, and there should be free movement between the peoples on the two sides, and some kind of a joint mechanism should come into being to administer the territory. It was, as I said, seriously considered. Whether it would have finally gone through in India, one doesn't know, because that's in the realm of speculation. But certainly it would have needed a significant political decision for it to go through. But it was a decision which was considered, and quite remarkably, it came from a man who had been the head of the Pakistani army, and the power in Pakistan rests really with the army in that country.
Interesting. Because of course in Britain, many of our, or a substantial proportion of our Muslim population is from Kashmir, from Pakistan-controlled Kashmir. We call, they go by the name here, Azad Kashmiris or whatever, but they
come actually from an area called Mirpur.
Mirpuris, yes, of
they
course.
are part of what was the united state of Jammu and Kashmir.
Yes.
And it's an area which falls between the Kashmir Valley and the Punjab province. And the state of Jammu and Kashmir, as you know, was a princely state. It was ruled by a Maharaja. And the Indian Independence Act, as passed by the House of Commons in Britain, which was basically the instrument under which independence was granted and the partition took place and Pakistan came into being, that gave powers to all these princely rulers, Maharajas and Nawabs, to decide whether they wanted to join either India or Pakistan or neither. And the Maharaja's initial decision was that he needed time to consider the matter. And so he didn't join either India or Pakistan, but ultimately, after Pakistan infiltrated into his territory, he opted for India.
Interesting. And all, well, the rest is history. And of course, I mean, we're talking about this, but this struggle over Kashmir and the tensions between India and Pakistan, really, I mean, some say are the greatest. We talk about the Middle East being the greatest threat to world peace, but because India and Pakistan are nuclear countries, nuclear nations, India with its Agni rocket, and you have a situation where, if God forbid something should ever get out of hand, this is a very dangerous situation, really, because they're both nuclear powers. Or you could go for the concept that what is it, mutually assured destruction, that the nuclear weapons stops Pakistan and India from going to war. I don't know.
Well, I think it is a deterrence in a way, but at the same time, the armies of the two countries, they stand eyeball to eyeball in a pretty tense standoff. I don't think as long as sensible people are ruling the two countries, there's any danger of a nuclear conflict. But in the event nuclear weapons fall into wrong hands, and let us not forget that the internal situation in Pakistan is a little worrying, although gradually I would imagine the Pakistani armed forces are getting on top. But in the unlikely event that nuclear weapons in Pakistan fall into wrong hands, then something really serious could occur. But India has a no first strike policy. It's a no first strike doctrine.
And one would hope Pakistan is the same.
Pakistan does not have the same policy. So there could be an accident, but I would imagine that the leaders of the two countries are sensible enough. And gradually in Pakistan, we are seeing a foundation of democracy. Because India has been fortunate in that it has leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, who firmly established democracy in India. But Pakistan has struggled with years and years of military rule. But finally, it seems that people are coming round to accepting civilian governments. And the longer civilian governments last, and the greater the democratic foundations become in Pakistan, I think the chances of peace between the two countries will increase.
Interesting. And I mean, had Netaji, had Subhash Chandra Bose, the man known as Netaji, had he lived, you never know. We might not have seen, perhaps, it's arguably possible, we might not have seen the partition of India. It might have been given enough weight to or enough momentum to those that believed in Indian unity to have saved India from this. In a way, it's rather tragic, isn't it? It is tragic, this breakup.
It is indeed tragic. It has cost the Indian subcontinent economic development, because resources have been diverted for defense and internal security, and we are talking about trillions of pounds which have been spent over the decades for the security of each country. If that money had been spent on education, health and other development matters, I think there would have been far greater prosperity in the region. I've visited Pakistan many times, particularly during my really active days as a foreign correspondent, and there I found several families whose fathers were soldiers and officers in Subhash Bose's Indian National Army.
Wow, yeah.
Including, by the way, the man who was accompanying him on that flight, that ill-fated flight, and who survived the crash, Colonel Habibur Rahman. His family too had settled in that part of India, now Pakistan.
It is interesting. It's very interesting to think too, if you're, I mean, might have beens, but had India, had your great uncle survived, and had he managed somehow to rebuild his influence, and the whole situation been different, had India not been partitioned, of course, if you're an Indian nationalist, then it would mean that India would be, if you united those three countries, India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, India would have been one of the most powerful countries in the world as a united India, wouldn't it?
Certainly, with peace within, there would have been that much of a better chance of progress and prosperity. Gandhi, ultimately, although he differed with Bose and he opposed Bose's inclination to use force over and above non-violent means, he ultimately acknowledged after the Indian National Army campaign that Bose and the INA had cast a hypnotic spell on the Indian people. Those were his very words. So ultimately, he was reconciled to the fact that Bose was a patriot, and although they had their differences, they were willing to bury their differences, and it was actually Bose, in one of his broadcasts from Southeast Asia, who addressed Gandhi as father of the nation, and which has now become official nomenclature in India.
Interesting. Well, we should move on to the third subject we wanted to discuss, which is relevant to all we've been talking about, the whole issue of non-violence versus violence as a mechanism for action, really. Perhaps that's putting it crudely, but let's move to this. Arguably one of the most famous leaders of non-violent struggle was Mahatma Gandhi. Based on the religious principle of ahimsa, which means doing no harm, Gandhi developed tactics for his nationalist movement to use against British imperial rule. These tactics involved an emphasis on non-violence and a vacillation between non-cooperation and active participation. Gandhi used this philosophy and sought compromises with his opponents. The challenge to the predominance of Gandhi and Gandhian tactics in Indian nationalism came from Netaji, who held an alternative vision. A true revolutionary, he felt, created the moment rather than waiting for it to arrive. He wanted freedom for India, and to some extent he didn't care who he had to approach for assistance. Netaji believed that the end justified the means. Gandhi, by contrast, believed that the means was everything. The question, the big, what do they say in America, the $64,000 question, the big question, because it is a big question, it's a big ideological question. You have Gandhi's doctrine of nonviolence, which was a doctrine whereby it didn't quite mean pacifism as some of us in the West understand it, because it meant you stood up for what you believed and, if necessary, laid your life down for what you believed, but you did not use violent action. As opposed to the other approach, the Netaji approach, which respected that, but also felt that there should be resistance that involved, for want of a better word, insurgency, rising up against the, with armed resistance then. And so you have these two ideologies, very, very powerful ways of thinking, struggling one against the other. Or at least they had a common goal. It was to get rid of the British, but these two dramatically different approaches. Just to put you on the spot first, I mean, even though you're his relative, do you view one as right and the other as wrong? Or you personally, do you see of these two approaches, is one correct and one wrong, or is that the wrong way of, is that an inappropriate way of looking at it?
I don't really see it as black and white. Right. Let me put it this way, that there is no substitute for nonviolence, no substitute for constitutional and democratic methods. The use of force can only be justified where there is no democratic opportunity. There's no democratic way forward. For instance, if you are heading a separatist movement or a movement against the present authority, and that authority does not provide you with a ballot box to prove your popularity, your majority, then I think violent means can theoretically be justified. But where there are democratic means, where you can stand for elections and prove that you have a majority and therefore you have a right to govern, then I think there is no justification for violence.
Right. So that being the case, putting it in a modern context, there is, for in a democratic nation, however, anything that is even in any way reasonably democratic, whether it's India today or Britain or Europe, there is, in your view, no justification. I mean, this, by your definition, there would never be a justification for terrorism.
Well, it's like this, that the transfer of power from British to Indian hands in India took place via negotiations and by virtue of a constitutional transfer of power. So there were cases of what the British would call terrorism, Indians would call a fight for freedom, and that did occur during the long Indian freedom struggle.
Right.
But the mainstream was always the Gandhian non-violent movement, which negotiated step by step and slowly in the provinces democracy was allowed, elections did take place, and therefore they were partly self-governing, these provinces in India, even before Indian independence. And so that was a process that was adopted by those who led the movement and Britain. And so ultimately it was, you could call it a handshake, and people went their different ways. Whereas in other parts of the world, you've had violent revolutions and violent overthrow of regimes or colonial powers, which was not the case in India.
Yeah, well, on those sober words, thank you. She says, really has been a fascinating discussion, and thank you for telling us about your great uncle Netaji, and thank you for being our guest on it. That really, bless you, many, many thanks.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So an interesting discussion, and it begs the question, do you believe in a non-violent approach to conflict, to struggle, to fighting for your rights, or do you believe in violent armed resistance? Very powerful question that really is relevant for struggles in today's world. I mean, where do we go? We are not seeing very happy times in the Middle East. It is a miserable situation for many of our fellow human beings who are facing war, civil war, struggle. And would it be better if we had, despite the terrible cost, because people have to lay down their lives if you're talking about non-violent resistance, but would it be better? Would it be better if we had a non-violent struggle for the things we believed in, rather than taking up arms? It's an important question, I think. Do email us with your opinions. The email address should be on the screen at the moment, and I would certainly be grateful. We all of us here at ANN would be grateful to hear how you think. And remember, I mean, if India and Pakistan, if things had been different, well, would non-violence made a difference? I suppose India and Pakistan would have been partitioned anyway, but I don't know. I don't know. What do you think about the partition of India? India would have been a much more powerful country if that terrible struggle for independence hadn't resulted in partition with 1 million dead. And the consequences remain to this day with the Kashmir problem, a problem that can and may, God forbid, result in another war between India and Pakistan. Hopefully that'll never happen. Interesting to hear about that concept of a kind of autonomous Kashmir that was being talked of there by Ashish Ray when he mentioned the Musharraf, was it? President Musharraf's approach, and had it been successful, what things might have been. Anyway, do write us on the Indian question if you have particular views on that. Do write us and email us and let us know your opinion on the whole issue of non-violence versus violence, and it's relevant to the Middle East today. We'd be glad to hear from you, and thank you again for being our guests on ANN Satellite Television.